This video was made in collaboration with Balkan Odyssey. To see his fantastic sister video focusing on the USSR and Eastern Europe, make sure to click the link in the description below. So a better title for this video might be How the USSR Created the Welfare State in Western Europe, but that's not quite as catchy. And it still might raise more questions than answers. After all, the USSR and Western Europe were mainly enemies, right? Well, yes, they were, but it was this same adversarial relationship that made Europe into a welfare state in the first place. The advent of capitalism in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries largely brought nothing more than misery to most people, many argue, and in many ways a worse misery than feudalism before it. Jason Hickel, in fact, argues that capitalism and colonialism with it, in fact, while bettering living conditions in the imperial core, overall worsened living standards globally. In the centuries since capitalism's creation, it had not really brought any real increase in the standard of living for anyone but the 1%. After all, there existed no extant challenge to the ideology of capitalism. Thus, there existed no real need to make capitalism look suitable or attractive when there was no alternative to compare it to in the first place. Other than for the brief failed French Revolution, which established something like a progenitor to a social democratic regime, capitalism largely remained inhumane, exploitative, and brutal. Of course, that was until the USSR came to power in 1917 under the new ideology of socialism. The USSR was for its time by far the most radically egalitarian state in human history. The USSR originally gave workers ideas like an 8-hour workweek, universal education, paid childcare, not to mention supposed liberal conceptions like increased empowerment of women in the workplace and ideas of multi-ethnic collaboration, among numerous other innovations. As a result, workers in the West were subsequently galvanized by many of these guarantees and so began to increase their advocacy for them. As Jomo and Popov write, the reversal of growing inequality in Europe followed the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the emergence of the USSR and other socialist countries. The peasants in the USSR were ruthlessly oppressed after all, yet it still led to a revolution. For the first time, the masses had truly stood up to their oppressors and instated lasting change. Before the USSR, universal healthcare had only ever been attempted once, in Germany under Otto von Bismarck. Of course, the specific reason why Bismarck did this was as a concession to social democrats to prevent an uprising from socialists. The subsequent welfare states that emerged in Western Europe were no different in their philosophy. Like Otto Bismarck, they decided to concede to the demands of the social democrats, who desired for the elites to simply grant concessions to the working class rather than give up their power completely in order to avoid risking another Bolshevik revolution in their own borders. An example of this can be seen in the German Revolution. Despite its failure, the elites of Europe were frightened by how close Germany had come to revolution in 1919, and as such began to reform their government to grant concessions to the working class. A similar situation also occurred in Norway. But many European states were still reluctant to grant any serious concessions, and the social programs granted were in the grand scheme of things rather minor. It was only after WW2, when the USSR was now not just a threat, but a world competitor, that the modern welfare state as we know it arose in Western Europe as a real competitor to the protections provided to workers in the Eastern Bloc. As Rasmussen finds, there was a clear correlation between a country's working hours and the level of threat that country faced, with countries under communist threat much more likely to have lower working hours, and those working hours clearly dropping only after the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. As he writes, "We observe an early divergence appearing between Comintern invited and other countries, but their trends are still similar pre-1917. The average difference in work hours is only 3 hours in 1916. This difference increases to 6 hours in 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, and jumps further to 12 hours in 1919, when Comintern formed. This difference is still 12 hours in 1923, after which it gradually declines. A moderate difference of about 3 to 5 hours persists, however, to 1989. As Albuquerque writes of the Cold War, this lasting conflict helped to shape the creation of common interest states. Under these common interest states, a social cohesion emerged because of the presence of a powerful external enemy, leading to reduced top income shares. And as Albuquerque and Weller write, unions became more powerful the closer their countries were to the spread of communism. On the other side of the bargaining table, employers agreed to reduce their gains from capital in favor of higher wages. The government complemented this common interest state by spending on the poor. The economic and political elites formed this Cold War coalition to redistribute income and reduce the likelihood of communist revolutions. The unions took advantage of this special conjuncture to push for higher wages, increasing the return of labor vis-a-vis the return of capital. Of course, the reasons for the welfare state arising are curiously almost entirely ignored in all of our history lessons about post-war Europe, simply pointed to as a result of economic development from the United States, without ever much delving into the actual policies of these states or where they emerged from. And this is for a very simple reason. It would have been absolute insanity as a capitalist country, politically, to allow for the idea that the reason your country had a decent welfare system was the world's first and most powerful socialist country. That's why these countries' economic developments are usually referred to vaguely as so-called miracles without any real material analysis. Ultimately, the thesis that the USSR's existence prompted the onset of social democracy shouldn't even be controversial. Throughout human history, the idea of reform to placate citizens from revolting has been ubiquitous. The push and pull between reform, or sticking to the old ways as it were, was an important question throughout the history of Victorian Europe, from England and France to Germany and Russia. But of course, reformers really never had much actual success until the Soviet Union's rise. As Rasmussen concludes after conducting their statistical analysis of working conditions and proximity to the USSR, the evidence in support of our argument is clear and robust. Fear of revolution contributed to reduced working time and enhanced the coverage and generosity of various social transfer programs in capitalist countries, even when accounting for several alternative explanations, and the effects seem to have persisted for decades. But not quite forever. While Western Europe adapted by granting workers many social democratic concessions, the USSR, in comparison, refused to grant their people what the West had to offer that they didn't, namely consumer products and freedom of even relatively benign and non-threatening activities like artistic expression. These mistakes and many others that are hotly debated to this day eventually, of course, led to the USSR's collapse. Western Europe has in many ways suffered from the USSR's collapse just like Eastern Europe has. Social democracy already began to experience backsliding with the rise of neoliberalism, but things have gotten much worse now that the USSR is gone. As Michael Parenti argues, the overthrow of communism gave a green light to the unbridled exploitative impulses of Western corporate interests. No longer needing to convince workers that they live better than their counterparts in Russia, and no longer constrained by a competing system, the corporate class is rolling back the many gains that working people in the West have won over the years. Even Slavoj Zizek, a rather anti-Soviet intellectual, admits as much. As he writes of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the capitalist system is ready to make considerable concessions to the workers and the poor only if there is a serious threat of an alternative, of a different mode of production that promises workers their rights. To retain its legitimacy, capitalism has to demonstrate how it works better even for the workers and the poor, and the moment this alternative vanishes, elites can proceed to dismantle the welfare state. Without an ideological competitor to keep capitalism on its toes, welfare states have gradually lost their, welfare. The ruling capitalist elites no longer have a real enemy to fight, and as such, a sort of decadence, as Vijay Prishad argues, has descended on the capitalist elite. They have gotten too comfortable with exploiting workers without worrying about any outside threat for those workers to look to as an alternative. Privatization has shot up drastically in Western Europe, even in former bastions of social democracy like Sweden and Finland, and inequality has also risen sharply in Western Europe as well, though much less so at least than in the United States. Now, with the coming rise of China, it remains to be seen if there will be a resurgence of social democracies yet again, or if the capitalist elite has become too comfortable or cocky in their positions as uncontested hegemons of the global order. The former will likely extend capitalism, the latter, well, who knows for sure.